Hello, and welcome to our landscaping class focused on sustainability. So today we're going to talk about how to have a beautiful, water-conserving, sustainable landscape using this idea called the watershed approach to residential landscaping. And by the end of this class, you'll know exactly what that means. So sustainable landscapes are different from conventional or traditional landscapes. In conventional landscapes, we often will think of only one thing. Is this plant pretty? Doesn't matter where it comes from, doesn't matter what its requirements are. If it's pretty, we'll put it in our garden, we'll figure out how to make it work. In South Orange County, what happens oftentimes is this means that our landscapes end up utilizing plants, such as lawn and various shrubs, that are not particularly adapted to our climate. That is the big switch we're going to make in this kind of landscape that we're talking about today, is we're going to make beautiful landscapes, and then we're going to add on all of these other benefits that only landscapes that are sustainable then can provide. So using this idea called the watershed approach to residential landscaping, it's important that you understand what that means because it helps you in all the design aspects of your property. Everything from choosing plants, to choosing hardscape materials, to determining how your landscape is going to function. And for many of you who want to attract butterflies and birds and make your landscape more ecosystem friendly, it will inform those decisions too. So in order to understand it, we need to really understand what a watershed is and how it behaves. Because your goal is to make your garden beautiful and to make it react to our environment or behave in our environment just like a watershed that is healthy does. So you'll see on this map, we show 10 different watersheds of Orange County. And it's a little bit different from maps that you're used to seeing because it contains only rivers, creeks, tributaries, the ocean, and ridges. And this is the key thing to understand about how a watershed works, is that a watershed is a place that's bounded by ridges, and so any water that falls on that landscape, whether it is rainfall or whether it is irrigation water, it is all funneled through contours in the landscape, and on the big scale we think of that as creeks and rivers and streams, and it ends up in the ocean. But that also applies to the smaller scale landscape of your own home property. It even applies to this tiny landscape where you have a patch of green, in this case lawn, between the road and the sidewalk. It also behaves like a watershed. It has a top, it has a bottom, water flows onto it, and it either goes through it and through soil and goes to the ocean underground, or it goes over top of it. And you can see in this particular little watershed that a lot of that water is going over top. And that's one of the things that we want to reverse engineer with this new way of thinking about landscaping. As if it had some kind of responsibility to the greater environment, which it does. Your landscape is important. That's one of the big messages of this landscaping class, is that your landscape matters. So if we really blow this idea of a watershed up even farther, you can see that in areas of our region here in South Orange County that used to be flat with little contours that rainfall would go through, they're now paved. And so that water that funnels into our flatter areas or our areas with small creeks and rivers and streams is now going over land. And over the last 50, 60 years, we've reversed the relationship between water and soil, so that water doesn't hit soil the way it used to, and soil can't clean it and purify it and filter it the way it evolved to do. So that's a big part of our landscape, is that ideal that watersheds are scalable and that you have one that is your garden, really, that has an impact on what is all around it. So we're used to thinking of our landscapes as being bounded by our property lines, but actually nature doesn't think of it that way. To nature, looking for habitat and a place to nest and looking for a place to feel safe, they don't see your fences, right? So when we think about redesigning our landscapes, we have to think of them as something bigger as well, and something that we're trying to kind of connect up to create these sort of corridors for healthy water movement, healthy landscape, healthy wildlife movement as well. But this is what we're starting with in many instances. We're starting with these really pretty simplified landscapes. And it's kind of ironic that even though these landscapes are actually quite simple, when you think of, them consisting of just a couple of shrubs and lawn, they actually use more than their fair share of resources. So it takes a lot of water, as we know. And as you'll learn later, I'm going to show you a direct comparison between the water that a lawn uses and the water that a climate-friendly garden uses. So you'll see the difference. So these gardens use a lot of water. They use a lot of power tools to keep all these shrubs maintained. They're not particularly good for our local ecology. So what we're going to look at is how do we switch that and still have the beauty that we need and that we want in our landscapes? Because really, that's important to us, and that might be the most important thing to us. But I would argue that equally important is the ability to have that beauty for us, but also that health to contribute to the rest of our environment. So you can see these same three landscapes that I just showed you before they transformed themselves into a sustainable landscape and after. And even though you may look at them and you may think, oh my goodness, there's more plants, there's more flowers, they must be higher water, they must be higher maintenance. Actually, no, there are some key elements to these gardens that we're going to talk about later that make them provide more benefits to the environment than the resources they use to maintain them. But it is important to know that your garden will look different. It won't look like your neighbor's. And so the fact that you understand, or you will understand by the end of this class, what went into making them the way they are and what kinds of decisions we made along the way in order to have a sustainable garden, you can tell your neighbors, you can explain to people who don't understand why your garden looks different. Maybe your HOA, maybe the boards and committees that look at your landscape and wonder, why does it not look like all the others? You can explain to them the benefits it provides. So welcome others in, show them what you've done to your landscape. Before we get into irrigation, I do want to throw into pretty stark contrast the water needs that many of us experience when we have a lawn versus the water needs of a native landscape. And this is an important thing to understand because for many of us, we use an automatic irrigation system and we may not even be aware of the amount of water that's going on our lawn. But the amount of water that a lawn needs to survive is scientifically studied all over California. And so we know exactly how much water a lawn needs in our region, and we know exactly how much water California native plants need in our region. So I'll show you how those two compare so that you can get a sense of the real savings in water that you can experience just by switching over to native plants. So California is divided into all these regions based on a bunch of different things, but for our purposes, it's really to highlight how much water a lawn uses. And in our region, a lawn, if it's perfectly irrigated, perfectly grown, not too much, not too little, no overspray, no leaks, what it needs is 46.6 inches of water a year to be green and growing and healthy with no stress. Keep in mind that many of our irrigation systems leak or they overwater or, things happen. So we rarely deliver 46.6 inches of water to our lawns. Usually we deliver far more than that, maybe even double. Compare this to what we get naturally, which is 9 to 13 inches on average per year. So we could be putting 6 feet of water or 8 feet of water without even realizing it on our lawns when nature will only give us 9 to 13, and the lawn really only needs 46, which is still a huge amount of supplemental water. So take a look at what this translates into when we make this switch. So for 1,000 square feet of lawn, it will take, using spray irrigation, which is what a lawn requires in order to be irrigated completely, about 52,530 gallons of water per year. Compare that to a native garden, same size garden, but using rotating nozzles, which we're going to talk about in a minute, which are significantly more efficient than spray irrigation. That native garden, to keep green and growing and beautiful, needs about 7,220 and change gallons per year, about 45,000 gallons less. When you think of how many 8-ounce glasses of water is that? How many 10-minute, 20-gallon showers is that? It's a really substantial amount of water that we can save even in this little 1,000 square foot area. And then when we combine that with capturing water in our landscapes by putting a rain chain or in some other way allowing rain to fall from our roof into our landscape rather than being piped under the ground, we can take it into our landscape, we can funnel it through our landscape using swales in rain gardens that are designed to infiltrate rainfall. So we bank even more water in the soil. This is all ways to conserve water without really even thinking that much about irrigation. So there's a lot that we can do that comes before even switching out our irrigation. Many of the landscapes in the NatureScape program, in the traditional turf removal program, they have opted not to have automatic irrigation at all. So you can have this kind of garden without going to the effort and expense of retrofitting your sprinklers, and you can still have a healthy garden. So now we're going to look at a few before and after examples of landscapes that started as conventional lawn and shrub-based landscapes and became watershed-friendly, sustainable landscapes. This is an interesting case study because this is a small front yard, and many people think that small front yards are too small to offer habitat value or to offer sustainability or infiltrate water or all of the things we've talked about so far. But that's not true. When you look at the top left picture, you can see that the yard with the old impermeable surfaces and the small patch of lawn really just looked smaller. And it really held no ecological benefit whatsoever. But after the transformation, when all of that hardscape was removed, it was replaced with permeable hardscape that allowed water to infiltrate. A rain chain took the water from the roof into the landscape through a swale and a rain garden. You can see that the landscape not only looks bigger and more interesting, but I can tell you from firsthand experience that the life in this landscape is spectacular. The butterflies and pollinators and the birds that call this tiny landscape home, it really convinced me that the small landscapes are just as important as the large landscapes. This is the landscape that we just looked at after 4 years, and you can see the difference. And here are some additional transformations for you to take a look at. HOA boards and committees. You can also use these exact tools in your common areas, in your clubhouses. This was a clubhouse, tennis facility and pool in an HOA that transformed from a traditional landscape to a native landscape. So when we're thinking about designing a garden, here's the way we think about a garden. And this is quite different from conventional landscaping. In conventional landscaping, we don't really think about plants as having a function. We just really think about them almost as if you're painting a landscape painting. Well, sustainable landscaping is quite different from that. We actually look at the beauty of a plant, but we also look at the function of a plant. And I'm going to show you how sustainable landscapes are put together, how they're constructed, so that you understand and can explain to others. They're basically constructed in 3 layers. They're constructed in the tree layer, the ground cover layer, and the seasonal flowering layer. I'm going to walk through each one of those with you now so that you know the role they play, you know how to care for them, and you know the benefit that they offer to your landscape and to our greater watershed. So let's start with trees. Trees are very important. As our heat has gotten higher and higher every year, trees have become even more important for their cooling and shading function. But what a lot of people don't realize about trees is trees have this ability to funnel water into soil, and they hold huge amounts of water in and around their root systems. So healthy, mature trees are just like a huge water cistern, and they hold that water, and all the other plants can use it, and the soil benefits from it. The other thing that trees do, they pull that water up and they release it into the air as water vapor, which is a good thing in an arid climate like ours, because we want our air cooler. We don't want to create drier, warmer conditions. We want to actually create cooler conditions. Trees can help us with that. One thing to know about trees: prune them into the shape you want them to be when they're older, but prune them when they're young. The first 5 years is really important to a tree. Make sure you get a tree, understand the tree, know what it will look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years so that you pick the right size tree for the location where you're going to put it. Don't put it too close to the house. Then you won't have to prune it every year. In our region, trees are heavily, overly pruned, partly because I think people think they should, which isn't really the case, but also because they put the trees that are too big for their location in a spot where they have to trim it all the time. So let's change that, and let's create this beautiful tree form in its first 5 years and plant the tree for the function and beauty that it can offer us. Okay, let's switch over to this next role of a plant in the landscape, and that is a ground cover. Ground covers do a few things. They shade the ground. They protect soil. They're almost like a little skin on the soil. They're low. They're 18 inches or lower. And they also provide a sort of mulch layer. They infiltrate water, and they're intended to cover all of the ground that is not covered by a path or a patio or somewhere you're going to use. We don't want to see big expanses of dirt in our landscape, because you know what happens when you have a big expanse of dirt? You ultimately end up with a big expanse of weeds. So we don't want that. So we really do want ground cover to cover the ground because it will suppress those weeds. And then the center layer is the garden lover's layer, and that is the seasonal flowering layer. That is where all your color is. That's where most of your maintenance is, by the way. A low maintenance garden, a very, very low maintenance garden, consists of trees, shrubs, and ground cover. As soon as you add that seasonal flowering layer, first of all, you're going to get way more pollinators and butterflies, and your garden's going to be an interesting place. But when that seasonal flowering layer is finished, it's flowering, it's set seeds, you're going to have to trim off those old flowers. So that's where the maintenance is in this kind of garden that has the seasonal flowering layer also. And I'm going to show you examples of all of those kinds of gardens. So this is a very low maintenance garden. It doesn't have that middle layer. It only has trees and shrubs. And I think this garden is probably about 5 years old, 6, maybe 7 years old. And you can see that all of the plants were chosen for their mature size. They were chosen to not require a lot of hedging and trimming and all of the work that goes into a garden, so that this garden can just grow naturally. At the same time, the color is provided by the foliage color, the silvers and the greens. It doesn't have a lot of bright color, but this is a very low maintenance garden. Now contrast that with these gardens. These gardens, not particularly high maintenance, but a couple of times a year you have to come through and trim off all those old flowers when they're finished blooming. So there is a little more maintenance, but truly nothing compared to what we're used to when we have to have someone come in every week. This is more of a seasonal kind of gardening, and for many people this is the kind of gardening they like to do. Keep in mind that when we plant gardens that include native plants that are either all of the garden or more than 70% of the garden, you will find right away that the creatures that know those gardens as home, those plants as home, they will come to your yard. And that is a real joy for many of us. I know that many of you want to design your own gardens, and you can do that with some of these tools and tricks, but it's really important to understand what goes into making a beautiful garden and also what goes into making a beautiful garden that is also a watershed-friendly garden. And while you can look at this garden and you can say, yes, this is a beautiful garden. It has color, it has texture, it has a beautiful man-made element, which is this wall. It has a lovely backdrop, which is the natural landscape beyond. There are some essential things that this landscape has done right, and there's some things that it could have done better. So let me show you an example of that. So the purple plant that you can see is called Spanish lavender. That plant is from Europe, and nothing wrong with plants that are from Europe when they're planted in Europe. But when they're planted here, what happens is all of our birds and our creatures flying by and looking for food and a place to nest and maybe some nectar or some kind of sustenance, they will fly by this, looking for something they recognize as home. And so there's a big difference between planting a beautiful garden that contains something that they don't recognize and something that they do. For example, this Spanish lavender could have been one of our native salvias. It would look very similar, but it would behave completely differently. And so that's what we think of as a watershed-friendly or a sustainable garden. Likewise with this Cape rush. This is from South Africa. It's a very pretty plant. It's upright. It has a very pretty look to it. But it could be our native juncus, which is also a rush. It has this exact same look to it, but it offers benefits to our ecosystem that this rush from Cape Africa can't offer. And then there's the strawberry tree, which you see a lot around our region. This plant is from Eastern Europe, but I'm going to show you how similar some of our natives look to these plants so that you can get a sense that, wow, I could have this exact garden as pretty as this using a different plant palette that would all of a sudden be watershed friendly and sustainable. The one thing this garden has done right, remember I talked to you earlier about reversing our relationship with runoff, which is the water that goes over land, versus water that infiltrates soil. Well, this garden, what it does well is it infiltrates water. There's virtually no sort of slabs that cause water to run off. And that's a huge benefit that this garden offers the soil and the creeks, rivers, and streams in our ocean ultimately. It could even make it better if it took water from the roof and it also funneled that into the landscape. It could take a low water year and it could make it a banner year for water every year if you utilize the water that falls on the roof of the homes. So from a plant perspective, look at how similar these plants are, but they offer a world of ecosystem services. So you'd be using our native plants like our Salvia Cleveland sage or our California gray rush or our bigberry manzanita and have the same look, but with all of these other benefits. So that's really the essence of what we're talking about today. Something to keep in mind, if you belong to an HOA, we have the same things happening on a pretty big scale, really, in our HOAs. And that is that we use plants from all over the world, except for California, and we maintain them in such a way that it's very difficult for them to be used as habitat or food or to be used in a healthy way by our ecosystem. So we can fix that in our HOAs. So we can replace some of these very pruned shrubs from various parts of the world with some of our really beautiful natives. And we can allow those natives to grow into their natural form. So this, for example, is in an HOA environment It's a big long strip of California lilacs, rarely ever touched, rarely ever pruned, and in fact, because part of the beauty of these plants is their form, we prune them by hand. We don't need to prune them with heavy equipment. So if you're part of an HOA board or committee, keep in mind that you can do this too. This isn't just for residential landscape owners. And when you do that, all of a sudden you make your really big HOA landscape hospitable for some species that are in trouble, like some of these butterflies. But we know a few things about what makes a garden beautiful. In fact, there are scientists that have studied making sustainable landscapes beautiful, that very narrow field, for decades and decades. And they know what people in general, even those who aren't formally educated in landscape or landscape design, they know what they find beautiful, what the sort of regular neighbor who doesn't know a lot about landscaping, what that person finds beautiful in a landscape. And we can use that knowledge and we can apply it to our sustainable landscapes to make them beautiful and to carry all these other benefits that we've been talking about. And this is what they found. They found that people find beautiful plants that are low and flowering at the curb. They find beautiful elements that show some kind of intentionality or this idea that you love and care for your garden. And you can see that in this garden. There's a beautiful little bridge which goes over the swale, which we will talk about later on in this class. There's a beautiful decorative rain chain, which we will also talk about later in this class. But you can see the plaque on the wall with the white rim. White in gardens is a key element. Any kind of a white statuary or a bench or even something like this small plaque, it denotes that this garden is cared for, it's kept, it's maintained, and that crisp whiteness is important to people to have a sense of beauty in a garden, along with the bright flowers and all of the other items mentioned here. Now we're going to take a look at common garden plants that we see in our region that are not sustainable and not native, and then we're going to look at the plants that we can use to replace them that have similar characteristics. This plant on the left is a California lilac. It's a beautiful plant that has so many beneficial features for our environment. It supports butterflies, it creates healthy soil. You can use California lilac to replace the common hydrangea. The island bush snapdragon is a plant that has beautiful tubular red flowers that can replace Cape honeysuckle. Some of our native plants are vulnerable to extinction, such as this Catalina silverlace on the left, a regionally native plant that is so easy to grow. We can replace the non-native dusty miller with the Catalina silverlace for a beautiful silver accent in our garden. And then Indian hawthorn is one of those drought-tolerant plants that really requires twice the water that native plants do in our region. And we can replace that plant with our native manzanita, which is a beautiful plant. It comes in all sorts of sizes and shapes. It has pretty flowers, and it's a real mecca for butterflies and hummingbirds. So this Mexican feathergrass is one of the plants we need to remove from our landscape. But we don't have to compromise the beauty of a flowing, delicate grass. Instead of Mexican feathergrass, we can plant purple 3-on. It has a very similar look, but it is native to our region. And boxwood is a ubiquitous plant in so many commercial and residential landscapes. We can replace that with our native pigeon point coyote bush, which is a dwarf form, a very small, probably 18-inch high form of our native coyote bush. Vinca is another one of those plants that can easily be replaced with our native ground cover strawberry. In this picture on the left, it's mixed with a native fescue grass. Ivy is a problem for many people who have it. It grows very, very vigorously, and in fact, it's another one of those invasive plants in California that we're trying to remove. So instead of that, the perfect plant to substitute would be a ground cover manzanita, like this one called emerald carpet. And then we have a lot of beautiful flowering plants in our plant palette. For cooler environments, for shady environments, or morning sun environments, you can replace your fortnight lily with this beautiful native Douglas iris. It comes in white, it comes in yellow, and it comes in purple, and every kind of combination in between. And then for those of you who love red in the garden, you can use our native yarrow. It's a low-growing ground cover with showy red blossoms. African daisy can be substituted with seaside daisy, which is California's pollinator-friendly flowering ground cover. I often see Brisbane box or Tristania in areas that require a narrow upright tree. The Tristania is from Australia. We have our own narrow upright tree called Catalina ironwood that is beautiful, fragrant, relatively small scale and narrow. So anytime you're thinking of using the non-native Tristania, try the ironwood instead. Rusty figs are infamous in our communities for surface rooting. They will uproot sidewalks and walls, and they're ubiquitous in our region. But we don't need to plant those plants here. We can plant our native Engelmann oak, which is vulnerable to extinction. It's actually on the International Union of the Conservation of Nature's red list, meaning that it is becoming extinct. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be planted in Orange County, because it's Orange County's oak. So instead of the rusty fig, plant the Engelmann oak. Watershed-friendly, sustainable landscapes are about more than only plants. What kinds of other decisions you need to make over your landscape? Many of you are going to create patios or structures of some sort in your landscape. And so we want you to have a sense of what sustainable solutions are to common landscape materials: concrete, lumber, and traditional drainage. Instead of using concrete, you can use permeable flagstone, permeable paving materials. You can use decomposed granite or pea gravel or any material that infiltrates water. PVC or vinyl is commonly used in landscapes. We are finding that plastic is becoming a problem in our environment. So instead of using essentially plastic fencing or plastic grass, there are better options. Of course, real plants are better than plastic grass, but there are many different materials that you can use that are more sustainable than vinyl fencing. And here are just a few. Bamboo is a renewable, sustainable fencing material. There are composite materials like this decorative panel that used post-consumer recycled materials to make the panel, the decorative panel. And there are also composite recycled fence panels that use post-consumer recycled materials. But if you are going to use lumber, look for the Forest Stewardship Council certification. That will show you and demonstrate to you that that lumber did not come from old-growth forests, which we need to conserve. And when you are clearing your landscape to get ready for your new landscape project, take a look around at what you already have to see what can be salvaged. Any material that we can utilize, such as an old concrete deck or old pavers or rocks and pebbles, in a new way, is material that doesn't end up in a landfill. So be creative with your landscape and think about what materials you can salvage and reuse, and it'll save you some money also.